Hello and good morning, friends. Welcome to the CEC-UGC live lecture. Dear friends, from today onwards, we are starting a very new series for you. And the series is on gender in Indian history, 1750s to 1940s and thereafter. In the first half, we would be talking on her story, whereas in the second half, we would be discussing patriarchy, masculinity and femininity. So overall, we would be talking on women and history. And for this very discussion, we have with us in our studios Dr. Shruti Vip. Dr. Shruti Vip is Assistant Professor in PGDAV Evening College, Delhi University. Dear friends, we would like to tell you all that she has done her PhD on gender issues in higher education, study of Delhi 1951 to 2001. Her research areas are educational policy and gender. So let's welcome our guest, Dr. Shruti Vip, and let's try to grab maximum knowledge through her experience. Hello ma'am, welcome to the EduSec lecture.
Thank you, Geetika. Today I'm going to speak on her story. Now this topic, her story, what does it mean? It basically means that history needs to be rewritten from the point of view of women. And this also means that rewriting inclusive, gendered and unbiased history is the need of the hour. In the Western world, the problem of history writing was realized much earlier, and in 1929 we have Virginia Woolf, who said that the life of an average Elizabethan woman must be scattered about somewhere. Could one collect it and make a book out of it? It would be ambition beyond my desire. She wrote this in her famous tract, A Room of One's Own. Then we have Gerda Lerner, Women and History, writing in 1986 in 1993. In this she said, when I started working on women's history about 30 years ago, the field did not exist. People didn't think that women had a history worth knowing. So before we proceed further, it is very important to discuss what have been the anomalies in history writing, that is, what have been the shortcomings so far. The past has been understood from a male perspective and women's voices have not been heard. Women had no history because men so far have dominated the social discourse. Women had been consciously excluded from the process of writing of history due to male bias and elitist sources. The process of writing her story has had multiple difficulties, ranging from the Oriental mindset, intellectual disinterest, and patriarchal ideology. References to women are often at the end of the chapter, and they focus invariably on issues like family, marriage, dance, dress, jewelry, festivals, etc., thereby reinforcing the pre-existing prejudices related to women. Her story tended to focus largely on histories of exceptional women. So even if there have been attempts at incorporating women in history writing, the focus was largely on incorporating history of women achievers belonging to upper caste, class and particular region and background. And then the term woman is not a monolithic category. This is a very important observation as far as Indian society is concerned. We have multiple divisions in our society on the basis of caste, class, community, region, religion, tribe. So all these multiple divisions must be incorporated when one is talking about women. So women per se as a category just does not exist. And wherever we are talking about women, the reference must be to her caste, class, community, nationality, sexuality, religion, etc. And of course, social and cultural identities have a far-reaching influence on women's historical experiences. The neglect of gender as an analytical category has generated ill-founded notions about women, and they were looked down upon even when they wielded power on the basis of their merit. For example, we have had women rulers like Razia Sultan and Noor Jahan, but they were wrongly projected as being power hungry or manipulative. Now let us briefly discuss what are the objectives of women's history, why there is a need to incorporate women in history writing project. First of all, there has to be a methodology of exploring women's history by analyzing the category of gender and to study diverse themes like folklore, family, household and everyday experiences. The endeavor has to start right now. Question the idea of men's history as universally human. Universal histories largely reflect men's interests, concerns and experiences to the complete neglect of what others went through, the marginalized groups, particularly women, the tribals and various other marginal sections of society. Then there is also a need to critically analyze the evolution of an ideology, the social relations that were implicit and the institutions that evolved over a period of time that have led to female subordination. And ultimately, the objective has to be to project women as active agents of history, which they have always been. Then, talking about women as makers of history, the feminist movement of the 1960s and the development of women's studies has been a very interesting development. Traditional historiography so far focused on documenting facts where men were dominant, that is, talking about wars, diplomacy, politics, commerce, etc. in greater detail rather than picking up issues where women were also equally involved. For example, agriculture, animal husbandry, family, ritual, folk art, household work, etc. were all regarded as frivolous and outside the scope of history. Though now there has been some change and for last 2 to 3 decades, a lot of work has been done in these fields also, which is definitely a welcome change. Joan Scott remarked in 1986, though women like men have been actors and agents in history, their experiences and actions are not recorded. Then Gerda Lerner said in 1986, women have a history and women are in history. They are and always have been actors and agents in history. Women have made history, yet they don't know their history. So again, a very sad state of affairs. Then lastly, in this section, I would like to say that gender is a useful category for analyzing various ways in which relations of power are constructed in society. Now, coming to the aspect of women as a category, women ought to be considered as a social group rather than a biological category which has undergone distinct legal, political and social experiences. Gender, like any other category, for example caste, class, religion or race, has been a very decisive factor in history. Social forces are crucial factors that must not be neglected, particularly, as I just said, in a country like India, where the divisions are definitely deep-rooted and have a history behind them. The opportunities and limitations available to individual women depend a lot on these social forces, divisions and their identity and must be accounted for. For example, the social capital available to a Dalit woman is definitely not same as is available to an urban working class woman. In 1996, Emma Tarlow made a very interesting remark. To write a history of women means to assert power, challenge authority at various levels of Indian society. And she talked about how there was a need to deconstruct history writing. Now, coming to various approaches to women's history, various historians have contributed in this sphere, and basically three theories that are talked about are: first is additive history, in which there is a re-examination of the sources that are already available. So basically, the historian needs to go through the kind of sources that are available on the basis of which history writing has already been attempted, and then take a relook and then uncover the role of women in those sources. Then secondly, it is genderized history, the theory of genderized history, in which the attempt is to rethink historiography and highlight gender differences as a key to the analysis of social relations. Then thirdly, there is contributory history, which hinges on female agency as well as patriarchy. So it recognizes that how women have been active agents of change themselves, and how if one explores patriarchal relations and evolution of patriarchy, then one can definitely reach to a more holistic approach to history writing. There is a need for another approach, I would say, which is not only limited to one of these three approaches, and this fourth approach can be of writing total history, because there is no denying the fact that everyone makes history. So irrespective of the fact that which sex one belongs to or which background one belongs to, we are all making history. So the approach has to be towards integrated history. Both the sexes equally contribute to making of history, which must be studied at length. The past did not account for women which were considered as deviants or on the margins. For example, the prostitutes, the tawayafs, the devadasis, and the courtesans, and all their experiences need to be taken into account, though an attempt has already been made to incorporate their experiences and the overall paradigm of hope and despair, but then a lot needs to be done. Coming to the methods of gendering history, no single methodological or conceptual framework can fit the complexities of historical understanding. Gerda Lerner pointed out in 1979 that it is important to incorporate experiences of all women to construct a new women's history. Even the existing sources, chronicles, literature, and archival information, if read in between the lines, can help in recreating past from a woman's point of view. So, don't let history become a master discourse or a meta-narrative. As pointed out by Bentley in 2002, history ought not be reduced to generalization. So, we ought to uncover the past, keeping in mind the deviances, the exceptions, and they are rather far more important than the meta-narrative or the master discourse. Some interesting developments have been made in this light in recent years. So, in 2000, we have an attempt made by Anila Varghese, who studied how the dress and the other aspects of women's lives in the Vijayanagar Empire influenced the architectural styles of the Vijayanagar Empire, and how the new styles that were emerging there, they were emerging outside the patriarchal control. Then a lot has been written about how an image of women emerged in Indian history. The image of women as a meek, exploited female who had not been given equal rights by Indian men. How this image emerged. So in this, I would like to speak on the role of Orientalists and the colonial administrators. The 19th century, by 19th century, Orientalism was taking keen interest in recreating the past and in projecting a particular image of ancient Indian history At times it glorified the Indian past, and at times it kind of ridiculed the social institutions that were prevalent as being exploitative to women. In this endeavor, past was presented as a homogeneous whole without any distortion. Orientalists like William Jones and H.T. Colebrook, associated with the Asiatic Society, reflected on a wide-ranging themes of Sanskrit literature, history, philosophy, etc. Then we have Max Muller, who collected and published the full text of the Vedas, which was declared as the natural basis of Indian history and Aryans, and also as the true ancestors of the race. Women in this entire process were not regarded as worth getting mentioned in this Orientalist account, except for a few outstanding women like Maitreyi, who indulged into a deeper debate with Yajnavalkya, and in that also it was projected that women were not expected to attain the highest knowledge of Atma or Brahma. What was deliberately avoided in this entire Orientalist discourse was the different modes of surplus appropriation and different layers of intermediary identities. The focus was always on to make the natives understand their obsolete past and applaud the efforts of the colonial administrators. So, most of the Orientalists depended for their sources on the textual material, which was mainly Brahmanical in origin and which viewed women mainly in the context of family and showed the inherent bias of the Brahmins rather than the actual practice of the people. The insistence on women's chastity and virtue was absolute. Then the role played by British administrators and intellectuals was equally dubious. So we have someone like James Mill, a great British historian, economist, political theorist, who wrote the history of British India. He declared Hindu civilization to be very degraded due to the status of its women. Hindu civilization excluded women from the sacred texts, deprived them of education, deprived them of right to property and a share in the paternal house, in the paternal property, and deemed them unworthy to eat with their family folks. So he justified the presence of the British Raj in India on the ground that Hindu men were unfit for self-rule due to this barbaric behavior with their women. Catherine Mayo's Mother India, that was written in 1927, was another landmark account that gave detailed excesses of Indian men and the horrible suffering of the child bride. The writing became soon a bestseller and served the colonial interest of justification of colonial rule over Indians and nullification of the demand for Swaraj, as this was also a time when the national movement under the aegis of Mahatma Gandhi was at its peak. Then we have Clarice Bader, who wrote Women in Ancient India. In this, a detailed account of the spiritual, ascetic and a completely devoted woman, the image of a completely devoted woman was projected who was ever ready to perform sati. So all these writers, they kind of earmarked a special place of Indian women and tried to project womanhood in a particular way that kind of replicated the dilemma of powerlessness, helplessness, etc. And as history writing of the medieval period was attempted, this period came to be projected as harbinger of various evils of Indian society like child marriage, parda, sati, to create a false notion of the earlier era being a golden age. Now, having said all this, I would like to briefly discuss as to what needs to be done, and from here how we can incorporate the lived and shared experiences in a far more holistic way. Now, I would be talking about this in our next lecture that would be following shortly. Thanks a lot. In this module, we would be talking about patriarchy, femininity, and masculinity. What do you mean by patriarchy? A term that has been used time and again. Patriarchy can be described as a socio-cultural system in which all the material sources are owned and controlled by men who also control the productive and reproductive behavior of women in the family. As had been pointed out by Hartman in 1981, men establish or create interdependence of solidarity among themselves that enable them to dominate. many others have also given a definition of patriarchy, like Holmes, writing in 2009, said that men usually have a greater share of the rewards, both in terms of wealth and status, which help them to maintain patriarchy. Then Wolbe, writing in 2010, declared that men dominate, oppress and exploit women, and this is what leads to promotion of patriarchy. Let us briefly now talk about the processes of patriarchy as to how patriarchy is generated, promoted and continues. Patriarchy is reflected in societies in multiple ways, that is, through the stereotyping, the socialization that starts right from the birth, vocabulary and body language, as well as the cultural values and norms. Then there happens a legitimization of the domination of men over women in all spheres of life within the private domain of family, extending to the public life as well as the workplace. Then a third important process is appropriation of economic, political and religious organizations, where men are the decision makers and at the helm of the affairs, whereas women are placed at the bottom of power hierarchy. Then lastly, men's work is considered more productive and valuable in comparison to the work done by women. Coming to the next important aspect, that is theorizing patriarchy. Various theories have been generated time and again to explain the true genesis of patriarchal influences. Wolbe, writing in 1990, proclaimed that patriarchy is invariably linked with capitalism and talked about 6 structures that are important to understand patriarchy, that is paid work, household work, culture, sexuality, violence, state and polity. Then Wolbe, again writing in 1996, spoke about a different kind of patriarchy that had emerged in the modern world. In this, he talked about gender transformation, that is changes in gender relations in the last half of the 20th century that were closely associated with the Industrial Revolution and beginning of a new kind of economic life, and how in the post-World War II era, it was the public patriarchy that began to exercise its influence along with the private patriarchy, which was already there at the home front. So as more and more women had access to education, they had access to work, they were working in factories or offices or organizations, they were also being exposed to this public patriarchy in addition to the private patriarchy which was already there. Then when one talks about private patriarchy, the subordination of women in the domestic lives is a very important fact that needs to be explored, because the experiences are carried right into the workplaces and the game continues. So public patriarchy restricts women outside, whereas private patriarchy restricts them in their homes. Coming to the aspect of linkages between patriarchy, capitalism and the state, Wolbe stated in 1994 that how the state should be seen as both patriarchal and capitalist. Why? Because the state promotes inequalities in various ways by limiting women's access to paid work, by not facilitating them enough, the criminalization of various forms of fertility control, then also support for the institution of marriage, etc. Research shows that a family, as soon as it experiences an upward economic mobility, withdraws its women from work. And women had never been participating in decision-making process within as well as outside families, thereby again promoting patriarchal mindsets. The public spaces, for example, the parks, the marketplaces, the public transport, administration, etc., have all been so far appropriated by men. What have been the implications of industrialization and technological revolution? Except for a few women, men have been encouraged to study medicine, engineering, astronomy, mathematics, and politics. As a result, entry of men into these spheres is easier, while women's reproductive capacity was often treated as their limitation. Though now a change has started coming about, as a recent welcome development that was announced by the government was reservation for women in technical institutions like IITs, but a lot more needs to be done. Coming to the linkages between femininity and masculinity. Every society defines social roles on the basis of gender. Since birth, a child is socialized according to the sex he or she has. Masculine and feminine characteristics are promoted through binaries like assertive versus modest, tough versus tender, rational versus emotional, aggressive versus docile. So, while girls are projected as meek, submissive, emotive, emotional, tender, patient, boys are projected as assertive, dominating, aggressive, competitive, and ambitious, all the traits of masculinity. Anne Oakley, writing in 1972, was a pioneer in explaining the social construction of gender through socialization processes. She used the term gender that was first used by Robert Stoller, a psychiatrist, in the 1860s. Oakley argued that early socialization of children within the family leads to people behaving according to their particular gender, and that needs to be taken care of by the parents as to what are the role models that they are projecting in front of their children and how they are forcing them to adopt various ways and means and survival strategies. Biological versus social. This is another aspect that needs to be taken care of. So, a woman is not only a biological entity but a social entity as well. So, in the past, while masculinity and femininity were treated as biological and thus naturally acquired by men and women, the social and occupational roles which give particular characteristics to the physique of men and women were projected as natural and not as society driven, which is again a very wrong way of projecting the facts. Despite massive changes in the wake of industrialization and modernization, the notions of masculinity and femininity continue and at times get reinforced. Here, a very important observation that can be made is with reference to nature versus culture. So, while women are considered as being closer to nature, men are considered as more cultured beings, being more in command of the resources, being more able to exploit the resources to their fullest maximum potential. So, there has emerged a work hierarchy. The tasks assigned to women belong to a specific category, and while men's work is considered far more productive, result oriented, full of cash incentives, women's invisible work remains unaccounted for as productive work. It is in this background that certain gender regimes have emerged, and childcare as well as housework fall in the domain of women even if they are working. Women's careers are typically interrupted as they retreat from the workforce to either bear children or to care for children, while males do not experience such breaks. Gender regimes and gendered work cultures are still firmly established, particularly in Indian society. Informal barriers push women back in their careers, promoting the sexual division of labor. Coming to the aspect of historical origin of gender binaries and how women were projected in Indian history, a lot has been written on the colonial period, how gender was projected in the colonial period in India. Colonial governance brought changes for all men, women and children in India. The spread of new communication technologies, railways, print medium, new educational institutions, they definitely brought about changes in gender relations among others. Print culture from the early 19th century resulted in widespread collection, composition and circulation of texts, newspapers, journals, biographies, autobiographies, which definitely talked about the lived and shared experiences of women and what all they were going through in the private sphere, as public sphere was still not open to them. Coming to women participation in the public sphere in the colonial India, by late 19th century, women became both the objects and subjects of discussions and debates in the new public sphere. So, the new cultural and audiovisual forms like photography, urban theatre, rural drama troupes, etc., they started capturing lives, experiences and depicting problems of women on in the form of entertainment. And by the early and mid 20th century, the cinema, the radio and then by the end of 20th century, the television, they started spreading information, knowledge and started creating perceptions about men and women in particular ways that were carried forward in a much greater way. Now, all these mediums and all these processes were creating a lopsided view on women, projecting a particular kind of image of women. The preconceived notion that emerged was that in Vedic times, women enjoyed an exalted status and equality with men, and by the Middle Ages, their status declined, whereas the truth was something else. The 19th century that came to be known as the age of reform movements, both the reformist and revivalist trends that were visible in the 19th century, they also picked up the issue of Indian women. So various humanitarian reformers like Raja Ram Mohan Roy, Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, etc., they helped in abolishing sati and propagating widow remarriage. And they also worked towards creating a more equitable Indian society by struggling against multiple forms of violence and discrimination against women and helping them to acquire education and the right to widow remarriage. The freedom movement again came as a big savior as women were forced to come out of their homes, and particularly the Gandhian ideology incorporated a far more holistic approach to women participation when women started participating in large numbers. Now, what emerged during this process was the new histories and a reflection on gender that again had some interesting developments to talk about. Till 1980s, most of the historical writings were about what great men did for women and not what ordinary women experienced. And after 1980s, a welcome move was made by various historians whereby feminist historiography from the late 1980s started talking about ordinary women's experiences, basing their work on a number of biographies and autobiographies that were written by women during 19th century. So, the reforms they talked about how the reforms in the first half of 19th century re-imprisoned modern women into a new cage of male desires and morality. So whatever was being done to bring about changes in the lives of women, to help them live a freer life, was being done with a preconceived notion that a particular path only had to be treaded and the deviations were not really allowed. Here we must talk about certain path-breaking historical works that were attempted by various historians who kind of incorporated this new kind of technique of history writing that went into making of an explanation of patriarchy and kind of projected a history from women's point of view. So here I would like to mention the work Recasting Women, Essays on Colonial History, 1989. It used Marxist and post-colonial frameworks to understand colonialism in the context of a capitalist mode of production. Then creation of modern middle class dissatisfied with the older feudal values and family ties. The newly emerging bourgeoisie copied British middle class families and aspired for educated Indian wives and mothers who could become good companions to their modern husbands and who would nurture their families on reformed, enlightened lines. So, the book talks about how a new kind of morality was being enforced, entrusted on women, and this morality again was quite limiting for their very existence. The various essays in the book reflected on texts written by men who tried to educate and reform women on principles that would serve their own new requirements and longings. So again, what men felt was right was definitely going to decide the future course of action for women. Even though men wanted to bring about a positive change in their lives, they wanted sati to come to an end, they wanted widow remarriage to take place, but all this was being done within set parameters and role expectations. Then we also have a series of writings by Uma Chakravarti, who critically discussed the ways in which different categories of modern nationalists romanticized and mythicized ancient Hindu histories. Then Partha Chatterjee talked about the way in which nationalist thinkers divided the world into two halves, that is, the public and the private domain. While the private domain was not to be discussed with anyone, and even the colonial regime had no power to interfere in that, the public world was only for masculine activities and allowing women exalted status in the home front. And whenever the colonial state kind of interfered in the private domain by talking about starting of reforms, then discussing age of marriage, which was very low, so trying to improvise lives of women by raising the age of marriage, the entire system collapsed. So we have Bal Gangadhar Tilak, who kind of put his foot down saying that this is not the public world, this is the private sphere, and Indian culture and civilization does not allow any outsider to interfere in that, even if it is on the basis of human argument, humanitarian grounds. So whatever, we will be doing it on our own, and no foreign power has the authority to interfere in whatever are the social customs and traditions of our country. So this private and public dichotomy has been beautifully depicted by Partha Chatterjee. The other collection of essays, that is Women in Colonial India, essays on survival, work and the state. They explored different facets of women's activities as factory workers, agricultural laborers, or their home-based production, their access to law courts, their participation in electoral processes and nationalist movements. Historians of gender hitherto have moved along these two main trajectories. The two trajectories that I am talking about are what patriarchal men did and what women's agency did. When I say women's agency, it means the initiatives taken by women. Now, these initiatives that to reform lives of women, or to bring about a positive change, to spread education among women, was not always the work of men, was not always the work of humanitarian social reformers. So women themselves were developing their networks, and this agency had started coming about in a big way, especially during the first half of 20th century, when a number of women organizations started emerging, and they were also working hand in glove with the national movement, giving it a far more active role as had been envisioned earlier. Coming to the issue of nationalism and masculinity, modern politics that was taking shape, it gave rise to new models of masculinities and femininities. So, the colonial rulers had stereotyped Indian men as ineffably conservative and often effeminate, except for the designated martial races like the Sikhs of Punjab. So, in their opinion, largely Indian men were not really fit to rule themselves, and there were definitely some points of dissent as well as points of collaboration with Indian views on gender. So just like Indian nationalists or traditional theorists or revivalists had certain mindset and they considered Indian society in certain way, many times it was replicated by the colonial administrators also. Modern politics aspired towards a political masculinity that was warlike, heroically militant and violent. Now, this image found a strong support among militant nationalists, Hindu extremists, revolutionary movement, and later among Hindu and Muslim communalists. Now, in this entire process of political mobilization that was going on, many similarities also emerged between Gandhians and revolutionaries. So, while Mahatma Gandhi was instrumental in bringing about women participation on a much larger scale, Gandhi's nationalism was also gentle, constructive, non-violent. And it was this very image of women as being meek, as being non-violent, as ever being ready to suffer and still not able to raise their voice. This kind of metaphor was used by Mahatma Gandhi for participation and for self-sacrifice. So the role of women had to be emulated outside. So the way women were behaving at homes, Mahatma Gandhi inspired men to follow the similar path of self-sacrifice. And for both, a renunciation of sexual desire was a patriotic duty. And both revolutionaries as well as nationalists, particularly Mahatma Gandhi, advocated the ideal of celibacy for the patriot. Both shared a notion of highly controlled, highly motivated, disciplined, ascetic, masculine and feminine selves. Coming to Tagore, how Tagore projected nationalism and in what ways he was different from Mahatma Gandhi in projecting this kind of an ideal of nationalism. Rabindranath Tagore's preference for individual self-fulfillment was supreme, and he wanted that before one starts living for others, it is important that one lives for oneself. So the whole notion of sacrifice, the whole notion of the whole image of a self-sacrificing woman was put to test by Tagore's philosophy. He advised patriots to first experience freedom in their personal lives and relationships, and then he also was apprehensive that too much of over-discipline and too much of regimented nationalist politics, however noble, however great its purpose was, would ultimately constrain and repress individual thinking, imagination, and moral sense. Now, coming to the issue of Hindu revivalism and nationalist discourses on femininity and masculinity, by late 19th century, Hindu revivalist nationalist discourses projected Hindu female chastity as the hope for future mankind as well as future nationhood. For example, Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay's novel Anandamath, it projected a particular image of motherland as the mother goddess, as the sacred symbol of the Hindu nation. So again projected, again presenting a very specific limited kind of image for women, which had not much scope for deviation. The partition of Bengal between 1905 and 1908 and the struggle that followed against the partition of Bengal gave an opportunity to women to once again participate in the freedom movement. And women were involved by the nationalist leadership to boycott British goods, to use indigenous Swadeshi items, and also to shelter revolutionary terrorists. But here again, if one talks about leadership potential of women, that was not really very well utilized. From 1930, the Bengali revolutionary movement, terrorist movement, began to arm women for assassinations of important colonial officials by adding them to the underground band of insurrectionaries at Chittagong, which raided the army and hid in the jungles to escape arrest. So these kind of activities definitely gave a platform to women to participate on an equal footing with men, and a spirit of gender equality, even though the revolutionaries themselves were not vocal about social issues, as their focus was primarily political mobilization against the colonial regime. Now coming to the role of Gandhi and the changing norms of femininity that emerged during Gandhian period, Gandhi expanded anti-colonial agitations into mass movements of peasants, tribals, and middle class from the early 1920s for non-violent non-cooperation against the colonial administration. And it is in this process that women joined the movement on a large scale, altering the very character of Congress organizations. They were coming out of their homes en masse, courting arrest, going to jails, even participating in picketing. But though this should have resulted in a more open and active female defiance of Indian social values, but again, the traditional roles were very well protected by Mahatma Gandhi for women, as the home was the first and the foremost duty that had all the duties in the private sphere had to be accomplished before they thought of venturing out. Gandhian politics also involved strategic use of traditional kinship practice and emotions. So, while all these changes were going on during the Khilafat movement in 1921, the mother of Ali brothers, a woman from an orthodox family, of Orthodox Muslim family, she began to address the giant crowd that had gathered to protest against the British abolition of the Turkish Caliphate after the war. Now, this again was a historic movement, that how the issue of parda could be transgressed. Now, this is a very important issue which would be carried forward in the next lecture. Thanks a lot.
With this note, thank you, ma'am. Thank you so very much for giving us a very, very precious session. And we would like all the students who might have watched us or would be watching the lecture once it would be uploaded on YouTube. So if you have any queries, do write to us at info.cec@nic.in, as well as you can watch the lectures on YouTube, as I have already quoted. So we would be meeting again very soon and would be discussing on another topic under the series Gender in Indian History 1750s to 1940s and thereafter. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you once again.
Thank you, Deepika.